Hello and welcome to today's training. This training is recorded to be watched in your own time, and today's topic is climate change risk assessments and business continuity planning. My name is Amy and I work in the Climate Northern Ireland team, and I'll be delivering the session today. The training content that we're going through is developed as a collaboration between Climate Northern Ireland and business in the community, with the aim of helping businesses and other organisations to help to better understand the risks and opportunities from climate change and the actions you can take to make your business more resilient to a changing climate. I'm going to start with a quick introduction to who business in the community is and who Climate NI is before we get started into the main content today. So Business in the Community is Northern Ireland's only network for responsible business, and it supports member organisations in a range of responsible business activities. This includes work under the heading of People, Planet and Place, and Megan, who I worked with in the development of this training, works under the Planet heading, and this covers supporting businesses with all things environmental and climate change related. Climate NI then is the team that I work in at Northern Ireland Environment Link, and it's a cross-sectoral partnership devoted to understanding and enabling adaptation and mitigation actions in Northern Ireland to address the climate emergency. To achieve this, we work on supporting the development of climate policy. We bring together networks such as engaging the research community and practitioners working on climate change, and we increase coordination and awareness of the climate challenges. We do all this to enable the delivery of climate action across Northern Ireland. So this collaboration between Climate NI and business in the community is funded by the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. And we're coming together today to deliver this training, which is part of a series of training that we originally delivered as webinars. And this is the first training in this series, but other topics include supply chain sustainability and understanding financial disclosures and financial resilience. As I mentioned earlier, this is a recorded training session so that you can work through it in your own time. We've also created a workbook that accompanies this training that you should have open at the same time so that you can use it at certain times throughout the session. At times through the recording, I will encourage you to pause the video and take a few minutes to work through the activities as we go through them today. The first session then that we're covering is all about climate risk assessments. And first of all, I think it's helpful to define what a climate risk assessment is. So a climate risk assessment in this sense today is a qualitative process used to evaluate how your business site and operations might be affected by climate change. And it also helps identify necessary mitigation and adaptation measures that you can implement in your business. So as I said, this is about climate risk assessments, and the other sessions cover different areas. But on the climate risk assessment heading, we're going to take a sort of step-by-step process through that. So we're going to think about what they are, what they could mean for your business, and how you might carry a climate risk assessment out. You can see on the screen now that they're what the 3 steps are. So we'll start today with identifying climate risks, then we'll look at how to assess the impact of these risks on your business, and we'll finish by getting a better understanding of how you can develop and what risk management strategies look like. So before we get started, it's important to ask the question of why is it important to look at climate risk assessments and plan for business continuity? And current and future policy obligations are one reason. A couple of key standards to look at are CSRD and IFRS S2. So first of all, what is CSRD? Well, that means Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And some recent amendments to that reporting means that many small businesses no longer need to align with these regulations. The focus is on large, with over 1,000 people, listed companies to disclose information on risks and opportunities related to their environmental, social and governance practices, with a particular focus on the impact of their activities on people and the environment. The guidelines are still relevant to businesses of all sizes and can act as a useful resource. And then secondly, we have the IFRS S2. This is a reporting standard which is currently voluntary, but is expected that this will change in time. The IFRS website has helpful industry-based guidance documents for food and beverage sectors and the infrastructure sector, for example. So getting familiar with reporting to this standard could put you in a great position for potential compulsory reporting, which may come down the line. Although a lot of businesses in Northern Ireland may not be required to report under these systems, businesses can show their value in the supply chain by demonstrating they have considered climate-related risks and opportunities. The topics covered in this workshop today, when put into practice within your own business, give you the opportunity to show that your business is measuring and monitoring your climate risk in a structured and consistent way, which is what a lot of investors, clients, and customers will want to see. We will also cover these two policies or reporting guidelines in future sessions in this series, so keep an eye out for those. So the first step is to identify climate risks to your business. And at this stage, it's always helpful to provide some content on adaptation and mitigation, which are the two main ways that we take action on climate change. So climate change is the result of rising greenhouse gas emissions, such as carbon dioxide and methane, which act as an increasingly thick blanket around the Earth, storing more of the sun's energy and causing global temperatures to increase. The impact of climate change and extreme weather events is already being felt around the world, as well as here in Northern Ireland. Even if we stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, we have now locked in some degree of climate change and the weather extremes associated with it. If emissions are not dramatically reduced over the next decade, severe, widespread impacts are expected, affecting many of the global systems we take for granted. Some of the main climate change impacts on a global scale include rising sea levels, loss of biodiversity, ocean acidification, and extreme weather events. So as I mentioned, there are two main ways to approach climate change. These are mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is action taken to reduce the severity of climate change, and the way we do this is by reducing our reliance on greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation involves understanding and preparing for the impacts of climate change. These are actions that help organisations, communities, governments, etc., to adjust to current and future impacts of climate change. And some examples to help sort of contextualize this. Some examples of mitigation actions then on the left hand of this Venn diagram include moving from petrol and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles and more sustainable transport options, as well as using renewable energy. Adaptation, on the other hand, then includes business continuity planning, which is obviously what we're covering today, as well as providing flood protection measures, whether that's to our businesses and to our homes. The actions in the middle of this Venn diagram then are actions that reduce emissions while also improving the resilience of our communities, our society, and our businesses. So this is really just to reiterate that today we are focusing on the adaptation side of things, and we're thinking about how businesses are being impacted and what we can do to prepare for those impacts. So a little bit of background then in terms of what the climate change impacts we're experiencing are likely to experience more so. So what impact will climate change have on Northern Ireland? The consequences of climate change in Northern Ireland will include flooding, extreme storm surges, heat waves, wildfires, and drought. Extreme events are already impacting our communities, economy, and our natural environment. So our main impacts are going to be things such as warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. And these can cause disruption, delay, and frustration to us as individuals, but also in the organisations we work within. Of course, we also live and work in a global market, and that means that global climate change impacts can also affect your business. These primary impacts can lead to a range of knock-on impacts across any organisation or business, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. So just to clarify, climate risk what climate risk is. Climate-related risks are potential adverse outcomes that arise from the impacts of climate change on the environment, businesses, and society. These risks are broadly categorized into two main types: physical risks and transition risks. Physical risks are risks related to the physical impacts of climate change. These can be risks that are event-driven, including increased severity of extreme weather, such as flooding, heat waves, and storms, but also more chronic risks, such as long-term shifts in climate patterns, such as sea level rise. Transition risks then are those related to the transition to a low carbon economy. These could be risks arising from climate change or from changes, in policy, technology, or market preferences in relation to climate change. An example of a transition risk relating to innovation and advancements in technology would be the development of new, more sustainable materials that would impact on the demand for more traditional materials. It is important to consider both the physical risks as well as the transition risks when completing a climate change risk assessment for your business. And now we do have some policy around climate change risk assessments and how this is done on a national scale. The Climate Change Committee produce an evidence report, which then feeds into a government publication called the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. The evidence report and government report are published on a 5-yearly basis, and the last UK government report was published in 2022. Alongside the government report, an evidence report was published for Northern Ireland, sort of a summary report, if you like, which sets out the main risks across various sectors, including business. The report highlighted 61 specific climate change risks and opportunities, and each one is given an urgency score. So 7 key risks and opportunities to the business sector are identified through the climate change risk assessment. And some of the key risks to business that require actions in Northern Ireland are risks to business sites from flooding, risks to business locations and infrastructure from coastal change from erosion, flooding, and extreme weather events, and risks through the disruption to business supply chains and distribution networks from extreme weather. There are also opportunities identified, such as opportunities for businesses from the change in demand for goods and services, and that can be explored in more detail through the UK Climate Risk website. The Climate Change Risk Assessment is a useful resource that you can reference when considering your risk alongside national level adaptation policy. In response to this report, Northern Ireland Government produced a report called the Northern Ireland Climate Change Adaptation Programme, with an updated version due for publication this year. Some other work that helps support this is some of the work by Business in the Community, which is the Environmental Benchmarking Survey report. And this is the longest running campaign at BITC, which is the NI Environmental Benchmarking Survey. And it's a self-disclosure exercise where companies are ranked on their environmental performance. Of those who took the survey in 2024, 89% have already identified climate risks, and of that group, more than 90% include those risks in their risk register, which is really positive, of course. So the top performing environmental businesses in Northern Ireland are already doing this. Now is a great time to start or to take the opportunity to refine your process and make it part of your business, your ongoing business strategy. So part of today's topic is around business continuity planning. And this term refers to the process of creating systems and strategies that ensure a company can continue its operations in the event of a disruptive incident, which could be any of the climate risks that we've discussed so far. The goal really is to minimize the impact of disruptions and help the organization recover quickly. Business continuity planning is in a strategic framework can really look like top management buy-in and appropriate allocation of resources, policy integration, so thinking about our environmental and climate policies being integrated with strategic frameworks within the business, Aligning business continuity planning with business goals, and there's potential for long-term cost savings or new opportunities for innovation, and they can be explored through these. Business continuity planning should be part of the organization's broader risk management strategy. It must be tailored to address key risks identified in strategic planning processes that are specific to the organization. And integrating climate risks into business continuity planning ensures that organizations are prepared for the specific impacts of climate change and can maintain operations even when climate-related disruptions happen. So integrating business continuity planning into an organization's overall strategy is essential for ensuring long-term resilience and preparedness. So we've covered a little bit of information there on some of the ways that you would identify climate risks. Now we're going to move into step 2. And we take the knowledge that we just gained on climate risks and we assess the impact it has on your business. So in the environmental benchmarking survey results, you can see that in the past 5 years, 62% of businesses have observed direct or indirect impacts of extreme weather events or climate change on their business. You can see on this slide then some quotes from survey responses in the follow-up to the previous question. Many businesses shared examples of how they have been impacted by extreme weather or climate change. Some businesses have given examples, such as the flooding in Newry, which impacted many businesses. Storms and flooding directly impacting on the supply chain, leading to delays, road closures, and suspending production for several days, as well as customer demand changes and insurance premiums increasing due to climate-related risks. As you can see here, it paints quite a serious picture when you consider all these impacts together. It's also clear that the impacts are being experienced by customers, employees, and suppliers. So all of these audiences, if you like, should be taken into account when we're thinking about our business continuity planning. Business impacts are the specific impacts to your business from climate change. And we can look at these as both direct and indirect. Extreme weather and more unpredictable weather can cause disruptions to business supply chain disruption or collapse. Business logistics can be impacted severely if you have global operations and rely on that supply chain quite heavily, where one climate impact on a global scale can have significant impact on a local scale. Even extreme weather or natural disasters outside the UK can have an impact on businesses here. Customer demands changing then, demanding more sustainable business, for example, and businesses then have to think about whether you're able to stay ahead of the curve and encourage and receive those customers and be ready for those customer demands. And then rising insurance costs is a big one that it's likely to impact individuals and businesses. So flood insurance in Northern Ireland is linked to the NI flood risk map, and you can look at this yourself to assess your flood risk in the coming years. So as I mentioned, we can split some of these impacts up into direct and indirect impacts. A direct impact could be flooding in Newry that leads to delays, and then an indirect impact from that could be the rise in insurance costs post-flood, and then having to increase costs of your products or services, which are passed on to the customer. So based on this, you might want to have a pause and think about how do you think your organization will be impacted by climate change in the future. Think in terms of short, medium, and long term over the next 10, 50, and 70 years. You can make a note of this in your activity worksheet to come back to later. Remember to consider the local impacts resulting from hazards such as flooding, storms, drought, and rising sea levels, as well as the systems that you rely on at a global scale and how they will be impacted by a changing climate. So we have a case study from NSERC, which follows through the training session today. So we're going to take a little minute to have a think and reflect on how other businesses looking at this from their perspective. So NSERC, for anyone who isn't aware, is one of the leading wine, beer and spirits bottle fillers in the UK. So NSERC is based across a number of sites in England and in Northern Ireland. They employ almost 2,000 people and produce more than 3 billion glass containers every year for leading global brands. NSERC is also one of the leading wine, beer and spirits bottle fillers in the UK, and they do all this while actively minimising their carbon impact. So for this case study, we asked them, how has your business been impacted by climate change? In response to this, they mentioned potential business impacts, such as disruptions to their main operations and supply chains, and damage to infrastructure which would have an impact to them as well. They are also noticing changing consumer demand and shifts in consumer preferences towards more sustainable products. This has required them to invest in decarbonising their operations. They have committed to zero emissions from glass by 2030. As a result of this. And in January 2025, Storm Eowyn caused extensive damage in Northern Ireland due to extreme winds. And although the NSERC site in Derrylin was not directly impacted, this event highlighted the need to take action to put effective measures in place for the future. We're going to move on now to a practical look at what climate risk assessment is and how you can get started. So a climate risk assessment is a qualitative risk assessment of how your site and processes will be affected by climate change. It is a risk assessment or risk management tool which can be used to improve the resilience of an organisation by making a database of its climate-related risks. For the session today, we've set this out, or sort of split the methodology into the following 5 steps, which we're going to take you through now. Starting with step 1, which is all about hazard. This is simply how you will organise your climate risk assessment. The potential climate hazards are the likes of flooding, sea level rise, and storms, and these will relate to the risk code in your risk assessment. For example, you can identify flooding as a hazard, and it will have risk code F. Each risk statement will then be numbered under this, so every risk relating to flooding will be F1, F2, F3, etc. All of the references to codes, etc. will make more sense whenever you're doing it in reality. And you can also have a look at your workbook to help out with that. So we would have identified our hazards, and then we would develop a risk statement. So a risk statement is a way to define the key elements of a potential risk by breaking it down into hazards, impacts, and consequences. For example, if we take a hazard, which would be, in this case, a storm, the impact or direct result of the hazard would be more frequent storms leading to higher wind speeds and more rainfall, for example. The consequences of the risk then, these are the direct and indirect impacts. For example, buildings being damaged or production being halted. So using a structured approach to writing your risk statement is important to allow for consistency in your overall risk assessment and to avoid any future confusion. It's also important because the next steps in the process will ask you to relate back to your risk statement. So we're going to look at an example now. The hazard that we're using here as our example is flooding. So the risk code that we're giving it is F. The reason and cause of the risk are highlighted in the text here in orange and blue. So the hazard in orange and the impact then is in blue. The consequences are in pink and green. And we split these up to help delineate between direct and indirect. So in pink, you have the direct impacts to a business, and in green, then you have the more indirect impacts. It's okay if you find it difficult at this first step to split them into direct and indirect impacts, as long as you can identify some of the consequences of the hazard happening in the first place and the impact of that hazard. So as you can see, to help we sort of set out a key. You don't have to highlight these all the time whenever you're going through them, but there's certainly the aspects that you want to think about. So again, just orange is the initial reason for risk, increasing frequency and intensity of precipitation, for example. Blue then is all about the impact. The fact that we have increased frequency and intensity of precipitation results in a greater flood risk. And then in pink, we have the direct impact on business, which here is damage to property and reduced accessibility to premises for staff. And green, as I say, is indirect impacts. And these are the secondary or indirect impacts on businesses. And this might be loss of business continuity, impacting reputation and finances. So risk assessments can then be simplified further and split out into different risk statements if you like. We set out some examples here, which you can have a look at another time in a bit more detail. But they take the previous slide and they split them up into a bit more detail. So now we're going to go into our first activity. Our suggestion for how to do this is to pause the video here, take 5-10 minutes, whatever you like, either on your own or with some of your team members, and consider. And the first thing that you're going to consider then is the potential risks to your business as a result of a climate hazard. So you could take floods, for example, and use the next 5 minutes to choose one risk and formulate it into a risk statement based on the structure that we have discussed just now. So refer to your workbook page 3 and 4 for this in particular to complete the activity. Okay, so now that you've considered or you've had a look in the first activity in terms of defining your risk statement and thinking about those direct and indirect impacts, now we're going to move on to the next step of the climate risk assessment. So next we identify inherent risk and we allocate a sort of score to that. So inherent risk refers to the level of risk that exists before any efforts are made to mitigate or control it. And using a scoring matrix, we can assess the impact and likelihood of each risk. This method then will result in a traffic light system of ranking risks. And we have an example here of how this works. So you essentially, as you can see, we have the scoring matrix with impact on one side and likelihood on the other. So the likelihood and what this term, I suppose, refers to is the probability of a risk event occurring. And then the impact is the potential consequences of the risk. And in the scoring matrix, you give impact a 1 to 4 rating, where 1 is low impact and 4 is a high impact. And then for likelihood, you do the same, where 1 is unlikely and 4 is very likely. So in this matrix, a score of 16 is critical, meaning it is the highest risk possible. The idea here is just to provide a sense of direction and purpose for your climate planning. You need priorities for action and to know where you're most in need of the response. So I think looking at the inherent risk and providing risk matrix helps to do this. And you can see here in terms of what some of these allocations, I suppose, of low, medium, and high would be like for both likelihood and then impact as well. Impact falls into negligible, minor, significant, and critical. So you can refer back to that as a bit of a resource as well. We'll use this we'll use this matrix actually in the next activity. And there's also a copy of it in your workbook to refer back to. Just one thing to note is you don't have to use this exact scoring matrix. If you have your own scoring matrix for risks, they can be other risks, not just climate-related risks in your business. You can apply the same method for scoring climate-related risks. So here's an example of a risk assessment from a toolkit we have called NI Adapts. And this was completed by one of the councils. You can see where the risk statement goes, and then in the first column, and then you can also see the headings for each of the other columns. So first of all, the risk statement goes in, and then you have the relevant department, and that might be within your organization. Then you use the scoring matrix and allocate the inherent risk by multiplying the likelihood and the impact together to get your risk score. As you can see, this one comes out at critical. And then these are the next two areas that we'll cover. You've got your current policies and procedures in place that would support delivery against that risk. So in terms of what's there to potentially help manage that risk. And then you're also assessing whether you have whether the risk is on a time frame of short, medium, or long-term risk. So you'll have a copy of the blank template like this in your workbook, and we'll use it for this next activity. So in the activity, you'll take the risk statement from earlier, just a few minutes ago, and you'll complete the remaining columns in the table. So pause the video here for as long as you need to complete this. So we suggest taking about 5 minutes. It might take longer, and we only suggest 5 minutes because we're just looking at one risk statement at the minute. And you'll want to complete the remaining sections in the table. So you'll assign risks to a department within your organization. You'll assign a level of likelihood, assign a level of impact, and then calculate your risk score. You'll also consider the policies this will align with within your organization. And then you'll also think about whether it's a short, medium, or long-term risk. So for this activity, refer to your workbook pages 5 and 7. So as I say, pause the video and take a bit of time to do that, to do this activity. So now you've completed the steps required for an initial run through a climate risk assessment. And the next step then would be to expand your table and include the other hazards, and also think about whether there's multiple risks under different hazards. For example, flooding may have multiple hazards and impacts. So we're going back to our case study now to see some actions NSERC have taken to align with the methodology that we've just looked at. So you can see that NSERC's climate risk assessment considers all plant assets and their activities. And how they did this was they completed site visits to understand how each site will be affected by the latest climate predictions. So this is really thinking about their hazard and risk statement. They assessed the severity of each risk depending on its potential to halt business operations. This would be their inherent risk. They noted that glass furnaces are constantly in operation, so their priority is to ensure that that isn't disrupted to continue the manufacture of their products. The assessment considers both the near and distant future, anticipating that the effects of climate change will increase in severity over time. And of course, that then brings in the timeline element of the methodology we've just talked through. And they intend to utilise the risk assessment as an active working document and planning tool in the context of business continuity. This way, the risks can also be reviewed on a regular basis. So this is planned in to their business strategy, which is another element of the methodology. So just to give some context in terms of the specific risks they identified, This includes the slowing down of manufacturing process caused by fluctuation in ambient temperatures, as well as condensation on their bottles, preventing proper labeling of products during bottling. So these are things that they've identified risks, and they realise that these are connected to the changing climate. So now that we've covered the climate risk assessment methodology and we've seen from NSERC how they've applied it to their business, we're going to move on to the third and final step in today's training. And this is all about the introduction to developing risk management strategies. So you've identified the main risks to your business from climate change and assessed the potential impact this may have on your business. You can now start planning for how to reduce those risks. Climate change should be incorporated into your overall business strategy. So think about how to add it to your company reports, risk assessments, and continuity plans, rather than keeping a standalone business continuity plan for climate change. Integrating business continuity planning into your organization's overall strategy is essential for ensuring long-term resilience and preparedness to the changing climate. Adaptation strategies are key output that many businesses are undertaking. These strategies would be where you develop plans to protect and reduce risk to your business from identified physical risks. You should also consider positive impacts such as new opportunities, and this could come from changing buying habits, for example. So in this adaptation strategies, you would want to think about physical risks as well as how that transition impacts your business. So thinking back to step one, you should also think about those transition risks, as I say. You want to reduce your exposure to transition risks by aligning your business with low carbon policies and market trends. For example, this could involve adopting more sustainable practices, reducing carbon emissions, and investing in green technologies. When we talk about planning for climate change impacts, this will involve financial planning, thinking about what resources and capital you have at your disposal in case of flooding event, for example. You'll want to think about policy development. Is climate change streamlined in your company policies, such as your risk management plan, and who in the company is responsible for this? Activities. Are there actions you can take today to better understand and reduce your risk? Monitoring. Don't forget about the impact of monitoring, evaluating, and reporting. If this is your first time incorporating climate change into your business risk assessment plan, you can learn a lot from being honest about what works and what doesn't work so well. So flexibility is really important in climate adaptation planning, and working that in from the beginning can mean that overall you have more business resilience as a whole. So now let's take a look at our case study again to finish out this section. So speaking about business continuity planning from NSERC's perspective, the process of developing a climate risk assessment helped NSERC to produce climate change vulnerability and risk assessments to establish how these risks are linked and may evolve over time. The assessment, currently in its final stages, provides a holistic view of the potential risks at each site, which can help support their operational and legal team to make more informed decisions at the executive level. So thinking about the governance of it there. This data can be used to support suitable CapEx funded mitigation projects for the near and far future. The identification of climate-related risks allows for additional adaptation measures to be identified and for the forecasting of effective hard and soft solutions to be made. Ultimately, the assessment allows for strategies and action plans for implementation to be rolled out as part of the overall business continuity planning and future-proof the NSERC's business operations for the long term. So now I would just like to wrap up this training session today with a bit of reflection, I suppose, on the benefits of preparing your business for climate change. And really, at the end of the day, how we like to say it is that it really ensures business continuity, whether that's future-proofing your products or services, minimizing damage and repair costs that you would experience because of extreme weather events, for example. But also we'd like you to think about your the opportunities. So it identifies this process that we've taken you through identifies new income streams and areas for business growth or competitive advantage. So it's just worth remembering there are opportunities to take advantage of. This is a proactive approach, and it can provide a competitive edge and long-term sustainability for your business. So just to reflect on the key aspects of the climate risk assessments that I've taken you through today. So first of all, as a reminder, you look at your hazards, whether that's flooding, storms, extreme weather events, sea level rise, etc. You look at your hazards, then you develop your risk statements alongside those hazards. And that's where you look at their direct and indirect impacts of the hazard. Then you do your scoring, so you look at the inherent risk through the impact likelihood matrix and you come out with a risk score. And then the fourth step is thinking about strategy. So think about the current policies and procedures you have in place that support your understanding of that risk and potentially help you prepare for the impacts of that hazard and the risks that you're adding those strategies to. And then finally, you consider your time frame. So you think about the timeline of the risk. Is it short, medium, or a long-term risk? So as I mentioned at the start of the day, this is one workshop in a series that we've developed in collaboration with BITC. So the next session, session 2, is on supply chain sustainability. And you can find that in the same place that you access this on the Climate NI website and BITC as well. So finally, I would just like to say thank you very much from myself in Climate Northern Ireland, but also from the BITC team. We really appreciate you taking your time out and engaging with this work that we've completed. We hope it's been helpful. Please do reach out to us if you have any questions. You can reach either Climate NI or BITC with the email addresses that are on the screen at the minute, and we'll be more than happy to help. Yeah, if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for other sessions you would like to see from us, we'd love to hear from you. And then just very finally, some additional resources that you can check out, whether it's the flood maps, our NI Adapts Adaptation Planning Toolkit, the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment, and the NI Business Info Guide on how to report on climate risk in your business. So lots of resources out there. Do make use of them, and we hope to see you at future sessions. Thank you very much.